On June 12, 1976, the body of 70-year-old Blanche Kimball was found dead in her home in Augusta, Maine. She had been brutally stabbed to death and was lying in a pool of her own blood. Police had been summoned by concerned neighbors who had not seen the pleasant elderly woman in quite some time. Who would savagely murder a sweet old woman? Those who knew her said she'd be there to lend a helping hand to friends, family, neighbors, or even strangers at any time, night or day. Was her kindness and trusting nature the reason she was killed? Or was it just a bizarre twist of fate that ended the life of the vulnerable old woman living alone? Welcome back to Mysterious 7. Today we'll be looking into the cold case of Blanche Kimball, a case that took 4 decades to solve. However, in 2010, investigators got crafty and were finally able to solve the case with the help of some chewing gum, of all things. If you haven't subscribed already, please consider subscribing, hit the like button, and click on the notification bell to get the latest content. Without any further delay, let's get into this mind-blowing mystery. Augusta is the state capital of Maine and the county seat of Kennebec County in the United States. It's located on the Kennebec River at the head of the tide. It's the principal city in the Augusta-Waterville Micropolitan Statistical Area and the home to the University of Maine at Augusta. And this university has over 11,000 students. Blanche Kimball, a 70-year-old woman in 1976, lived in Augusta, Maine. She was raised by parents Elliot and Fanny Bell in Albany, Maine. Blanche was never married and never had children. Blanche came from a small family. She had a sibling who died in 1916, a half-sister born when she was 10 years old, and 2 aunts and a handful of cousins who lived out of state in the 1970s. She'd been retired for 3 years from her job as a dental technician and practical nurse at Toga's Veterans Administration Center. Blanche resided on State Street, which is a 4-lane street that's now flanked on either side by a few apartment buildings, gas stations, and auto dealerships. Blanche Kimball lived in a sizable 2-story wooden frame house, as described by the Kennebec Journal. Yet the house itself has long since been leveled and the land turned into a parking lot. Blanche was living alone in that large house in 1976, yet she had occasionally rented out rooms to transient boarders previously. Her neighbors, as neighbors do, kept an eye on Blanche's comings and goings. They began to notice, in the middle of June 1976, that the retired woman who lived next door hadn't been seen for days, perhaps even weeks. In actuality, Memorial Day weekend was the last time anyone saw Blanche Kimball. Blanche hadn't entered or exited her home on State Street in almost 2 weeks. Finally, the worried neighbors called the police out to do a welfare check on their elderly neighbor. On June 12, 1976, Detective Sergeant Carol Clement of the Augusta Police Department knocked on the door of 352 State Street to check on Blanche. Knock, pause, listen. He repeated the sequence several times, but each time he was met with silence. He wiggled the knob to see if it had been left unlocked. In the middle of the 1970s, it was not unusual to find an unlocked front door in central Maine. However, after giving the door a fast half-turn, Detective Clement discovered that it was, indeed, locked from the inside. He tried knocking again before deciding that the only way to get inside Miss Kimball's house was by force. He described the house as being in general disarray upon entry. It was impossible, at first, for him to determine whether Blanche was just an untidy person in general, or if the house had been ransacked. However, as Detective Clement made his way through the first-floor rooms and into the kitchen and living area, he realized he wasn't just dealing with a messy home. Detective Clement discovered Blanche Kimball's decomposing body on the ground in her kitchen. Glass shards were strewn around her body, and there was blood splatter on the kitchen cabinets. Her dress had been pulled up, exposing the lower half of her body. Investigators would have to wait for the autopsy to find out for sure how Miss Kimball died, but it appeared that she'd been stabbed. The blood on the floors and walls had darkened and dried. One thing was obvious. They were dealing with a homicide investigation. According to the autopsy, Blanche Kimball died from multiple stab wounds to her head and chest. It was clear that she'd been lying there dead for at least quite a while due to the state of decomposition. Upon being notified of Blanche's death, some relatives flew from Massachusetts to help the local police in the investigation. But first, police began to talk to those closest to Blanche. In this case, physically close, meaning the neighbors, who always kept a watchful eye on the kind older woman. Almost every neighbor they spoke to mentioned a situation that took place a few months before the murder. Gary Robert Wilson, a drifter, was in need of a place to stay a few months prior. Blanche had a spare room that wasn't being used. Gary was only 27 years old, so there was a sizable age gap between the two of them. Since he was a drifter and new to the area, Blanche offered him the room and some food at no charge, covering all of his costs herself. During his short stay with Blanche, it was becoming more and more apparent to the neighbors that this man was a shifty character and all-around bad news. Neighbors claimed that he rarely spoke to anyone and was frequently observed acting rather strangely outside the house. While he didn't directly start any fights while he was at Blanche's house, he gave off the impression of someone who was used to making trouble and was aware that people were suspicious of him. Blanche had a slightly different perspective. She genuinely believed that by helping and getting to know this stranger, she would be able to better understand his odd behavior. Given that she led a solitary and quiet life, she was happy to have the company. The neighbors weren't surprised because, as it turned out, she'd done something similar before. Nobody made a big deal out of Blanche's kindness. After all, it seemed to make the old woman happy to help. Even though they didn't particularly like her new house guests, they weren't overly worried. They assumed that the drifter had likely left the house when the noises in Blanche's home fell silent. But now, they were shocked by the real cause. Gary Wilson, the lone suspect, was nowhere to be found when the police went looking for the man. He'd left no evidence behind when he left the area several days earlier. No amount of searching could find him, as he had no real ties to the area, and there was nothing in the home that could connect him to the actual crime. Even the weapon used to kill Blanche was missing, despite the fact that forensics had stripped the house bare and examined nearly every nook and cranny of Blanche's house. It hadn't been found in the nearby streets either. Officers grew worried because they suspected that the knife may have been dropped into the nearby river, which would have destroyed any traces of evidence that had been used in the gruesome slaying. The only chance they had of solving this horrific murder of a woman who did nothing wrong except to try to help someone in need lay in finding Gary Wilson. 3 days after Blanche was found dead in her home, investigators finally thought they had caught a break when Gary Wilson was seen breaking into a nearby home. Police were quickly sent to the area, yet he somehow managed to elude capture once more and fled the city. Despite an intense search, he could not be located. By this time, both state and local police were involved in the case. They continued their investigation and interviewed many more people, but failed to turn up any new leads. It seemed that when Wilson fled the area, he took all hopes of solving this case with him. Blanche's friends and family never lost hope that someday there would be a clue that would lead to finding her murderer. Unfortunately, like so many cases from the days before more advanced technology was available, her case would sit cold for decades. Now, let's fast forward to 2010. Our story brings us to Seattle, Washington. Seattle is renowned for being the home of several significant technology companies, the birthplace of grunge music, and the capital of coffee. The Space Needle and Pike Place Market are two of its well-known landmarks. Seattle is also called the Emerald City for its abundance of greenery and mouth-watering cuisine, beers, and wines. In 2010, the transient population was swarming the streets of Seattle. One night, 2 homeless men got into an altercation on a street corner. The argument was loud and attracted the attention of numerous onlookers. At some point during the argument, one of the men brandished a knife. Witnesses called the police, who responded to the scene. One of the men fled the scene, while the man with the knife was detained and brought in for questioning at the station. When the man was asked his name, he responded, "Mr. Rob," adding that he had pulled a knife on the other man out of self-defense. Because the victim was never located, no formal charges were brought against Mr. Rob, and he was let go after police confiscated his knife. In an attempt to identify the other male involved in the fight, the knife was taken to a forensics lab. A week later, when the results came back from the lab, there were some curious findings. 2 different types of blood were discovered on the knife. One was recent and came from the still unidentified male victim that evening. The other, however, was 34 years old. It belonged to none other than Blanche Kimball, whose case, by that time, had been cold for decades. Investigators were able to determine that this was, in fact, the knife that 70-year-old Blanche had been viciously killed with years earlier. At that point, they realized that the Mr. Robb was actually Gary Robb, who went by the name Gary Robert Wilson, the man who had stayed with Blanche in the days before her murder. After further investigation, detectives discovered that Gary had been in and out of the prison system since leaving Augusta after the murder in the mid-70s. The charges were almost always minor, but frequently had a violent undertone or appeared to be alcohol-related. He was never entered into the CODIS database. Now that they had the weapon used in the attack, and they believed the identity of the killer as well, they were still faced with some challenges. They now not only needed to locate Gary, but also gather more evidence directly linking him to Blanche's murder. They'd also need a substantial sample of his DNA to connect him to the case. The Maine State Police Department requested a DNA sample from the Seattle State Police Department. Both departments seemed to be struggling with ideas of how to gather this evidence. Before a feasible plan of action to prosecute Gary could be developed, someone would have to come up with a way to gather DNA from a man who was basically a ghost. The Seattle Police Department began searching the neighborhood for Gary. Due to the size and activity of the city, it was unlikely that they could locate the man a second time if he did not want to be found. One undercover agent made the decision that as soon as he was able to find Gary, he'd use his skills to trick Gary in order to obtain a DNA sample. The plan was simple, but brilliant. He eventually found Gary after days of searching. Realizing Gary's weakness for fast cash, he offered to pay him to participate in a chewing gum survey, which, of course, was just a ruse. He stated that the survey's purpose was to test a new brand of chewing gum that would soon be available for purchase. In this case, the undercover officer provided Gary with several different flavors of gum. He'd chew in front of the officer and then answer some brief questions about taste, texture, and other factors that distinguish one type of gum from another. Then he would spit the gum out. After he finished the survey and paid Gary the money, the undercover officer waited until Gary had disappeared from view before collecting the chewed-up pieces of gum and bringing them back for testing. And with that, investigators were finally able to conclusively connect Gary Robb, aka Gary Robert Wilson, then 63 years old, to Blanche's decades-old murder thanks to the DNA found in the gum. Incredibly, Gary managed to evade justice for another 2 years after his DNA was positively matched, but was finally apprehended in October of 2012. The case garnered national attention as the oldest unsolved homicide in Maine to result in a charge. Robb, a Vietnam vet and former POW, pleaded guilty despite claiming that he had no memory of the incident. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but died just 2 years later in a prison hospital. Some of the neighbors and family members had been in their teenage years when Blanche was murdered and were still alive to hear the news of Gary's arrest. They heard about Blanche's kindness and helping nature from their parents. Most did not think Blanche's killer would ever be caught, but justice always prevails in the end. The case of Blanche Kimball also gave some hope to the loved ones of victims all over the country whose cases still remain unsolved. One thing we have to admire is the combination of hard work, determination, and creativity demonstrated by the officers in the case. What are your thoughts on how this case was solved? Do you think a bit of trickery is justified when hunting down a murderer? We'd love to know your thoughts in the comments down below. Meanwhile, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that like bell before you leave. Until next time, stay safe and keep checking back to Mysterious 7 for more amazing cases like this.